Hello everyone, GoldenNova here. Today's video is brought to you by my Patreon's Quasar Commander, the foremost supporter on the Patreon of this month. They get to choose a topic for me to cover, and as we've been closing in on the completion of the Archetypes Explained series, we've been seeing some increasingly unhinged topics. Chaos is a pretty loose approximation of an archetype despite being a big power player in the scene, and the Goblin Gift series is more aesthetically linked than anything else. But today's topic marries the unhinged lore of Yu-Gi-Oh's iconic monsters and some cards that have some great competitive history. Its centerpiece has been the subject of much controversy, which has spiraled out into the historic tale of a rich noble enduring the hardships of economic collapse, and using their slimy charm and capitalistic know-how to claw their way back to the top. Brace yourselves, because we're taking a trip through Yu-Gi-Oh's multiverse and financial landscape with Upstart Goblin Explained. Today's episode is brought to you by my lovely patrons, as well as the wonderful people over at Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales and save 5% on your order by using coupon code GoldenNova at checkout. So what's the deal with Upstart Goblin? Hey, great question. Before we go into the long and storied history of the card, we should all probably get on the same page. Upstart Goblin is a normal spell card that draws you a card, then your opponent gains 1,000 life points. A pretty simple effect, and one that has seen a wide variety of opinions over the years. Upon first blush, the card seems absolutely worthless. You end up with the same amount of cards in your hand, but your opponent walks away with extra life points. However, this just made all the little freaks out there love it more, especially with the introduction of cards that facilitated a deck known as Nurse Burn. Utilizing cards in the vein of Bad Reaction to Samochi and Dark Lord Nurse Reficule, you would turn cards whose downsides was giving your opponent life points into pure value. Soul Taker no longer trades an opponent's monsters for a crisp 1,000 life points they get to put right in their savings account. You took their monster, spit in their eye, and still made them miss timing on effects for the inconvenience. Gift card isn't a way to spread cheer and goodwill. It was a blue eyes white dragon with next day shipping, and the delivery address was your face. And Upstart Goblin was a one card mulligan that you made your opponent pay for the privilege. However, over time, players would come to realize an important truth. Upstart Goblin ended up with the same amount of cards in your hand, but now your opponent has more life to work with. But for all that, it enabled you to essentially play below the prescribed minimum deck size, creating some crazy deck math. Basically, if you played a 40 card deck, but 3 of those cards were Upstart Goblin, the fact that Goblin replaced itself would effectively put you at a 37 card deck, raising the odds that you would see the cards you were looking for more often than someone who was playing a bulky 40 card deck. Even the life point gain wasn't a detriment as the power level of monsters increased, meaning that 9 or even 10,000 life points wouldn't keep your opponent safe from an OTK. It's left an indelible mark on how the game has been played, sparking probably the first big community discussion around deck building that wasn't just play good cards that are good, elevating card evaluation beyond what could be seen on the surface level. Trust me, if you were around during the card's peak, you know that the Upstart Goblin discourse could get even more heated than the Pot of Desires discourse. Though, to be fair, nothing beats Pot of Desires as a -9, that was just peak. Heck, it had such an impact on deck building that this card was limited at some point. However, as the game progressed even further, engine cards that outpaced Upstart Goblin would be released, turning this trick of probability calculations into a suboptimal choice, at best. And as it turns out, this change from valuable format staple to common box chaff would reflect the journey of the Upstart Goblin himself, and we'll see how that turns out as we continue the video. In general, most of the cards deal with card advantage in some way, either accruing it, removing it, or just shuffling it around in strange ways. Heck, in a bid to diversify their portfolio, you'll even see life point manipulation come up a time or two, much like the original card. Honestly, there was no better way to start up this video than with Upstart. And now that we've got the flagship card out of the way, let's take a look at the rest of the lineage, starting with the monsters. Goblin of Greed is a level 4 Earth Fiend monster with 1,000 attack and 1,800 defense, making this an Alistair. As long as this card remains face-up on your side of the field, neither player can activate an effect by discarding from his or her hand. This is honestly a card I'm surprised we haven't seen more of. Discarding is one of the most prevalent costs in the game, not just for a number of older utility cards like Phoenix Wing Windblast or Karma Cut, but even for one of the game's most impactful monster types, hand traps. While Goblin of Greed is on board, you can't be Ash Blossomed, possibly the most used in the entire bunch. Heck, it shuts off most of the Ghost Girls, with the notable exception of Snow Rabbit because it sends itself to the grave. Very funny. And every so often you have archetypes that need to discard stuff to function. But I guess the main issue is that the floodgate effect is reciprocal, and with how widespread discarding for cost is, it's hard to force any kind of asymmetry with this. Not to mention it doesn't have any archetypal overlap with another theme that might make use of this outside of like Goblin Bikers. But I wouldn't be surprised to see it crop up at some point in the future, so keep your copies close at hand. It'll be effective against your opponent, save for the non-binary ones. Remember, wording in this game is very important. Sending is different from discarding after all, and because this only stops the he/hers, the they/thems can pitch Necroz's ritual monsters like there's no tomorrow. And don't even get me started on the play lines the neo-pronoun crowd are labbing. Scrounging Goblin is a level 4 Earth Fiend monster with 1000 attack and 2000 defense, and if this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they can hand you a card from their hand to negate the effect. Otherwise, you can add one Goblin card from your deck to your hand, except a copy of Goblin Fan, which is actually named Tengu's Fan originally. Not that it matters if you're seriously playing Goblin Fan in the year 2025, you've got to report to the zoo, because you're an animal. The intended play sequence, I believe, is setting this face down and your opponent runs into it while scouting, chipping them for enough damage to proc the effect. However, it's doubtful that they'll ever give you a card out of their hand if they can help it. Even if you're running a Goblin Bikers deck, your opponent would just assume you would play something more proactive than this card if you were serious in searching any of your key game pieces. Then, if you somehow want to get even more value out of this, you're gonna have to turn it to attack position and find a way to attack your opponent's life points, which is not the safest thing for a 1000 attack monster to do. Really, this card is already well below expectations within the frameworks it's supposed to be working in, so there is no excuse to be running this outside of some kind of theme or gag deck. That being said, I do sense a kindred spirit here. Scrounging Goblin does kind of feel like what it looks like to ask people to subscribe to your Patreon so they get cool perks and keep a roof over my head. Wink wink nudge nudge. Alright, now it's time for a section with a bit more meat on its bones. The spell cards. Dark Factory of Mass Production is a normal spell card that targets 2 normal monsters in your grave and adds them to your hand. This is another spell that seems simple and easygoing on the surface, but has led to some devastating brews. Sure, you can get back some vanilla bead sticks to help repopulate your field, maybe even modern decks like Magic Heat and Sue Ship that vent normal monsters all the time will appreciate the +1 in card advantage, but the real appeal of this card can only be known once you've dabbled in the forbidden world of deep draw Exodia decks. With Dark Factory around, you can pitch your limbs to cards like Hand or Card Destruction without worrying that your win con is now in the garbage. Now they're just on a little vacation until you pick them up from the Skull Servant Daycare Center. While I doubt you're going to be rocking the boat too hard with this one, however you use the card, for what it does, it's invaluable, doing things from putting key cards back into your hand to just increasing your card economy. And honestly, the best part about this is that it connects Upstart Goblin with Moki Moki, and we've already delved into how outrageous that tale goes. I'm telling you, the things you learn on the factory floor, this video truly is the jungle of Yu-Gi-Oh! Media. I'm basically the Upton Sinclair of the community. Goblin Thief is a normal spell card that burns your opponent for 500 damage and increases your life points by 500. That's right, a 1000 total life point swing by virtue of the fact that you are essentially stealing those life points from the opponent. This is a design that would be revisited later in the game in relation to the live and or evil twin cards in the context of sending your favorite streamer bits and subs. Take that connection for what you will. And for them, it works great. A punishing, taxing effect is a great way to disincentivize your opponent from playing optimally to avoid penalties, but as a one-time effect on a normal spell card, you're gonna be regretting it. Remember folks, crime doesn't pay. Except in life points, and trust me, the conversion rate is terrible. Land Flipping is a normal spell card that targets a face-up card in a field zone. Banish it, then place it face-up in the other field zone. Then, you can choose a field spell with a different original name in the current controller's graveyard and place it face-up in the field zone of the player whose card was banished. Okay, that seems pretty complex, so let's render that down a bit. Basically, you change the control of a field spell from one duelist to another. Then, you take a field spell from the grave of the person who just got that field spell and put it onto the field of the person who lost their field spell. While there are a lot of edge cases, this is basically a great way to swap field spells with your opponent. If you have one and your opponent does too, by giving your opponent control of your field spell, it'll put theirs in the graveyard, which now becomes a valid target to take. So long as they have different names though, don't count on using this in the mirror match for a useful little pick-me-up. And all the better for it though, since it doesn't activate the field spell, just places them. So any value you get from actually playing them does not exist here. You'll want to be aiming to get field spells with great continuous or activated effects. But it also requires both players to be on field spells, and no amount of side decking will be able to compensate for that. This only works in formats saturated with field spells, so keep your eyes on the competition. But the real reward is that you get to play another of the games within a game that suffused the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Real Estate Fraud! Peeking Goblin is a normal spell card that has your opponent revealing the top 3 cards of their deck. You choose one to place on the bottom of their deck and place the other 2 on top of the deck in any order. This can be helpful across 2 axes. First, it can take a good card and put it way down underneath the deck where your opponent will never find it, and second, because you get to reorganize the cards to your liking, not only can you do so in a dubious order, you'll know what order they're in for the purposes of effects that care about knowing what the top card of your opponent's deck is. Now, Spiral would rather just guess on one effect to scout it out so their future effects can land the mark, but if you lack a critical mass of deck stacking effects, this can work wonders for you. That said, that niche is so incredibly narrow that it's still about as much of a joke card as it gets. Honestly, I'm just impressed that the Moki Moki antenna seems to work as a lockpick against a giant vault that doesn't seem to have any locks on it. Huh. Single Purchase is a normal spell card that you can only activate if you have 3 or more cards in your hand other than this card, and none of them are monsters. Banish your hand face up to add a monster from your deck to your hand, and if you do, you can't normal or special summon any monsters for the rest of the turn except monsters with that same name. So I guess break out the Cyber Dragons. You give up 3 cards in hand plus the Single Purchase, and those cards in hand get banished. So no graveyard synergies there. But for all of that, you can add any monster in the entire game to your hand. So you better be getting a wicked strong monster out of this. It's a real shame that this only lets you banish non-monsters too, but I guess otherwise you would just play this in decks that would recoup the costs too quickly, or otherwise use them as a starter for things like Metaphys, which does not appear to be the card's intent. Cause that monster you get has to last you from the turn you get it and all the way through your opponent's turn because it is not getting any kind of backup. In this regard, it's kind of like the Left Arm Offering of Monsters, a card that sacrifices your whole hand for that one perfect monster. But Left Arm Offering gives you the chance to combo off into the sun. Single Purchase wants to keep you on a single transaction, and that's it. I'm not sure there's ever going to be a singular monster that's ever good enough to justify using this, and honestly, this whole interaction seems like a rip to me. I mean, Upstart has the Pot of Duality, one of the most prized pieces of card selection in the game, and you're trading it away for what, 3 measly coins? Come on, have more faith in your goods and services, buddy, otherwise you're never going to outpace inflation. That Grass Looks Greener is a normal spell card that you can activate if you have more cards in your deck than your opponent. You send cards from the top of your deck to the grave so you have the same number of cards in your deck as your opponent. Yeah, Upstart Goblin wasn't the only card to shape how the game was played. Grass is one of the highest risk and investment cards in the game, and with it comes a fantastic amount of rewards. With 40-ish card decks being the optimal size, committing to running the full 60 means this one effect can mill you for around 20 cards, maybe even more if your opponent plays a whole bunch of cards on their first turn to thin their own deck. This makes it a perfect platform to host all manner of graveyard effects. Shaddoll's, Burning Abyss, Tearlaments, Phantom Knights, there are so many decks that get turbocharged by losing a third of their deck. In fact, remember how we likened a Single Purchase to Left Arm Offering? Well, that Grass was one of its most prolific search targets. Because even losing your hand means little when your potential graveyard has so much to offer. Though now, with cards like Triple Tactics Thrust, you can tutor this up with much less of an issue. And you'll need them now more than ever because this card was so powerful that it is now limited, making the prospect of the 60-card pile, once again, a pipe dream. Real shame, though honestly I wouldn't be surprised if it got limited not for its power, but because the Goblin was asking for more time off. With Sniffus constantly harassing his yard, he must be busy with all the constant lawn care. Hidden Fangs of Revenge is a quick play spell card, and neither player can activate cards or activate effects in response to this card's activation. When a monster declares an attack, you can destroy 2 set cards you control, and if you do, negate the attack. Then, if any monster cards were destroyed by this effect and sent to the grave, choose one of those destroyed monsters and destroy as many monsters your opponent controls as possible with attack less than or equal to that monster's defense. Then, it becomes the end phase. Wow, we have swerved way off course with this one. We've gone from economic downturns to politically motivated murder, but I'm sure not complaining. This is a very gimmicky card, no doubt about it. One imagines you played this in a deck that has a bunch of big defense monsters that you set, and when your opponent swings in, you sacrifice that monster to nuke your opponent's entire board. And that's not outside the realm of possibility, but you might find more success utilizing it in decks that set their monsters in the spell and trap card zone. See, Hidden Fangs checks to see if any monster cards are destroyed as part of the effect, and no matter what it may be treated as, cards like artifacts and the recently released toy cards are always monster cards. This means Hidden Fangs works double duty as an enabler against opponents who are just too shy to go after your back row for fear that they won't hit anything meaningful, or worse, waking the dragon. So when they attack, you crush your own back row, reap the rewards, maybe even pop some monsters, and then basically turn skip your opponent, putting them on the back foot and you in the driver's seat. Though remember, with that little then conjunctive, you do have to destroy at least one of your opponent's monsters to get the phase skip, so try to play something meaty. Speaking of meaty, wow, this is a big change up in the art style. I'd hardly even recognize this as the Upstart Goblin. And you know, maybe it's not. Considering Luigi Goblin Gioni over here has the delay, deny, depose knife, this might be a distant, deceased, and decayed cousin. Jar Robber is a quick play spell card that you can only activate when Pot of Greed is activated. Negate the effect of the Pot of Greed, and draw a card from your deck. This card is in the same camp as Neo Bubbleman, being effectively banned because it works with another specific card that is also banned. Now, I can kinda get it. In early Yu-Gi-Oh!, the company was reluctant to ban or even limit cards. You're basically telling your audience that they need to gamble on your funny little cardboard loot boxes, but some of those cards you can never use. Trading cards are a grift at the best of times, and banning feels like the worst, even if it is ultimately necessary for the health of the game. But to try and stave that off, why not introduce cards that are hard counters to the power cards, so as not to make anyone mad that they can't play the cards they pulled from their packs? Jar Robber is an example of that, alongside other specific hosers like Whitehole, Anti-Raigeki, Griffin Wing, and Call of the Grave for Monster Reborn. Hell, Call of Darkness is a second anti-Monster Reborn card. And notice how all of these are meant for cards that have, at one point or another, touched the ban list. They're not out there making cards like this for Legendary Sword. And it feels like it should be a win-win, right? You don't have to ban the card, and now you can sell a whole bunch of new cards to solve the problem that you created. It's basically capitalism speedrunning at this point. But if you want a game that lasts for a long time, this is basically poison. Fall into this design space too much, and you eventually show your player base that you aren't interested in creating new and innovative angles to your game. You'll just print anti-Monster Reborn again and expect another big wad of cash. And they aren't fun to play either. Unless your opponent plays the specific card that your anti-meta pick of choice counters, it's just stuck in your hand, rotting, doing nothing. This is why we don't see cards like this being printed anymore. It's a lazy attempt at solving the issue that doesn't even fix anything. Which means that, despite how worthless this card is for its in-game effect, it's a fascinating look at how designers tried to account for game-warping effects and the mistakes and lessons that get learned along the way. Which is in stark contrast to Upstart Goblin, who will never learn his lesson and will continue to be a vile little creature until the day it shuffles off this mortal coil. Put that pot down! You're scaring it! Goblin Circus is a continuous spell card that, once per turn during your end phase, reveals the bottom card of your deck, then places it on top of the deck or banishes it face down. I'm not sure what the target audience for this card is. I guess it lets you essentially choose to draw from the bottom of your deck, and if you choose not to do that, well, I mean, it was on the bottom of your deck anyway. Statistically, you weren't going to see that card, so banishing it face down isn't a problem. But because you do all this during the end phase, you can't take advantage of any effect that requires you to know the top card of your own deck, and your draw phase basically negates that knowledge when it comes back around to your turn. Maybe it's got some synergy with cards that specifically look to put cards on the bottom of your deck so you can see them sooner, and generating a face-down banished card might be good for Gizmex. But there are better ways to handle this stuff that are way more efficient, so this should be saved for only the silliest of brews. Trust me, considering the cast on call here, you'll be in good company. Second, Coin Toss is a continuous spell card that, when a coin toss is performed, you can choose to redo the coin toss, reflipping all coins if multiple are involved. So if you don't like the results of your Barrel Dragon, you can't just reflip all the tails, you've got to go all in. This is a major boon to any coin toss card, boosting your odds of success by a significant margin, as you only have to use this when you don't flip well, and you only have to win one of those 2 flips. Sadly though, outside of Coin Toss Turbo, there really isn't a shell for this card to exist in. Arcana Force might seem like a shoo-in, but your goal is to use Light Barrier to just decide the effect you want without leaving it to chance. And not many decks incorporate coin tossing mechanics even sparingly, because you're adding even more randomness to a game where the composition of your randomized opening hand dictates the course of the rest of the duel. It's a neat card to have handy, don't get me wrong, I'd rather have it around than not, but it doesn't really accomplish much in the wake of card design that has left it by the wayside. I do like how it mirrors the original Upstart Goblin art though. Some rich asshat is going to be making people scrouch for points one way or another, so at least this time, Karma got involved. Tilted Try is a field spell card that, when you draw for your normal draw during the draw phase, you can reveal one of those cards and place it on the bottom of the deck, and if you do, draw a card. And when you draw by a card effect, you can reveal one of those cards, send this card to the graveyard, and if you do, place the revealed card on the bottom of your deck, and if you do, draw a card. So this field spell essentially gives you a redo on your normal draw every turn, a nice second chance to dig for one card in particular, and if you use something like Pot of Desires, you can get a redo on one of the draws involved, though that is a one-time thing. However, it does fix the Pot of Desires problem. You ever banish 10 and draw 2 only to find that you actually drew just one card and a second copy of Pot of Desires? Well, with this, you can just ship it back to the bottom and try again. Heck, you might even draw your third Pot of Desires. Wouldn't that be a fun story? Effects like this are very nifty when attached to other effects that are actually accomplishing things. Thunder Dragonhawk having a mulligan is nice, but you wouldn't play it if it didn't have a Monster Reborn effect attached to it, just saying. However, because it places cards directly on the bottom of your deck, it has now opened the floodgates for Goblin Circus synergies. I am running for the bunkers as we speak. If I see even one viable Tilted Try Goblin Circus combo in the comments, I am going to become the Upstart Goblin, a fate worse than death. Alright, the spells are out of the way, now it's time for the trap cards, the meatiest section yet, having more cards than even the previous 2 combined. Pretty funny since it all started out as a spell card. Bubble Crash is a normal trap card that can be activated when any player has 6 or more cards on the field or in their hand. The players then select and send cards to their respective graveyard until the amount remaining on the field and in their hand is 5. So if your opponent is absolutely flooded with card advantage, you can force them to come back down to a more reasonable level. Did they just draw 10 cards off of Maxi plus Fool Loss? Well now, half those cards are going in the trash. The big drawback is that the affected player gets to choose, and they have a wide pool to choose from since they get to pick between their hand and field. This means they're always going to keep the cards that are best for them, while bidding the cards that work best in the graveyard. And reducing down to 5 is still a pretty healthy amount for them to work with, so they aren't broke per se. It's a neat idea, but ultimately ineffective, and makes me want to move on to another card that I think is a vast improvement almost immediately: Heavy Slump, a normal trap card that you can activate if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their hand. They shuffle it back into their deck, then they draw 2 cards. So in this scenario, where your opponent has drawn an obscene amount of cards, you take them from the heights of card advantage all the way down to the ditches of poverty. And because you don't send any cards to the graveyard, you don't have to risk any yardage synergies. Heck, they don't even get to pick what card they keep, they shuffle their entire hand back. It's got a much stricter activation condition than Bubble Crash, but a payoff that's actually worth the work. Sorry to burst your bubble about that. Maybe you should go see a doctor about it. Dr. Slump, that is. Got it. Dang, my end of section jokes are so clean. Dark Scorpion Combination is a normal trap card that you can only activate while you control face-up copies of Don Zalug, Cliff the Trap Remover, Dark Scorpion Chick the Yellow, Dark Scorpion Gorg the Strong, and Dark Scorpion Meanie the Thorn. During this turn, any of these 5 cards can attack your opponent's life points directly, but the battle damage they deal becomes 400. The damage debuff is unfortunate, but you will be enabling all of their effects that trigger when they deal battle damage, and they're all still pretty good honestly, so if the Dark Scorpions ever get the core set revitalization treatment, keep this in mind. In fact, if you're in the mood for a few custom cards, you can check out this video where I made a few Dark Scorpion custom cards for a video. It was very fun. But I'm going to save any further musings for a dedicated Dark Scorpion Explained video. The real reason that this is in this video is because they seem to be assaulting a group of goblins, including the Upstart one. What? What's going on here? Is this contributing to the Goblins' financial downfall? It'd be hard to have any assets when a group run by Christopher Walken absconds with all of your stuff. This is all making so much sense now. And they say Yu-Gi-Oh! Lore is confusing. Fine is a normal trap card that has you discarding 2 cards. Yup, that's it. No frills, no strings attached. If you ever need to discard 2 cards out of your hand at quick speed and don't mind waiting a turn, this has you covered. But boy howdy, are there a million better options. Don't even give this a second thought. Despite the name, it is not, in fact, fine. Good Goblin Housekeeping is a normal trap card that draws you cards equal to the number of good Goblin Housekeepings in your graveyard plus 1. Then, take a card from your hand and return it to the bottom of the deck. So when you activate the first one, you essentially lose a card in total. The second copy goes even, and the third copy ends up being a +1. This makes it a pretty bad investment since you can just play 3 Jar of Greeds and get a similar result more consistently, but it has had some fun brewing to maximize this card's potential value. Hypothetically, if you activated all 3 copies of Good Goblin Housekeeping on the same chain, then on a further chain link, activate something that sends all of those housekeepings to the graveyard. Let's use Malevolent Catastrophe as an example. Maybe I'm attacking. Then, when the housekeepings resolve, all of them will see 3 copies of housekeeping in the graveyard each. This means each copy will draw you 4 cards and then put back 1 each, resulting in a total +6 of card advantage. But you have to be playing in Magical Christmas Land for this to work, so while it's a funny example of how the game checks for information, it's not actually practical. Which is odd because I think this is the most frugal I've ever seen the Goblin, dutifully budgeting things out. If I didn't know any better, I'd say we're looking at some kind of redemption arc. Sadly, I can see that the Goblin is using the Fatal Abacus, which means that monsters dying is part of the calculation, so nope, still sinister. Return is a normal trap card that you can activate when your opponent adds any number of cards from the grave to their hand, to make them shuffle one of those cards into their deck. So it's kind of like a version of Drop Off, but for recovering cards out of the grave instead of drawing from your deck. And thankfully, instead of putting them back in the graveyard, you can sign them to the deck. It has been wholly outclassed by all the DD Crows we have available, on top of the fact that Ghost Bell exists, but this was made long before those came out, so it gets a bit of a pass. And see, this is why you keep the receipt. You never know when a big greedy goblin is going to sell you an off-brand pot of greed. You've got to have your receipts in order. Sales Pitch is a normal trap card that you can activate if your opponent adds any number of cards from their deck to their hand, except by drawing them, by their own card effect. You reveal a card from your deck and add it to your hand, but you can't activate cards or the effects of cards with that name for the rest of the turn. So your opponent activates a search spell, and you get to search anything. For slower paced games, this can really help ensure you have the right card to get your combos going. In fact, I'm most familiar with its power from Domain format, where 2 additional opponents means more chances to trigger the effect and more targets other than yourself to help keep the heat off of you long enough to use that silver bullet that you tutored up. I'm a big fan of it, but really? You're only asking for 2 coins? You've gotta learn to economy better, please! The Forceful Checkpoint is a normal trap card that you can activate when an opponent's monster declares an attack. Look at your opponent's hand, and if there's a monster card, negate the attack, then discard a monster from their hand. Your choice. So it takes a peek no matter what, but only negates if there's a monster hiding among the contents. Seems a little appropriate to the art. Good job, team. My big hangup with this is A, it's another battle trap, which is very gauche, and B, this presumes your opponent has any number of monsters in hand that they haven't used already. As engines get more and more streamlined in decks, and with monsters being the primary means of advancing the game, there's less and less chance of one hiding out in the hand pre-battle phase. If at all possible, those will just get folded it into whatever combo the opponent is trying to accomplish. Granted, it's not impossible, but I find it highly dubious. The likeliest scenario is that you hit them while they have a hand trap they're stalling on because they've been waiting for the perfect time to use it, but that is some wishful thinking. However, despite that, I'm glad that the devs went out of their way to fill a niche that's long been left ignored in the community. And all the Nova heads in the audience will know what I'm talking about, because we all love customs cards. Waking the Dragon is a normal trap card with no activated effect. Instead, if this set card in its owner's control has left the field because of an opponent's card effect and is now in the grave or is banished, you can special summon a monster from your deck or extra deck. That's right, in an effort to disincentivize mass back row removal, the devs decided to print a landmine. Now, this does come with some restrictions, even beyond the fact that your opponent has to be the one to trigger this. Namely that it doesn't ignore summoning conditions, so there's a whole host of monsters you can't even touch with this, even if you are trying to cheat them out. Thankfully, there are still some fantastic options out there. Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon was a staple option since it lacked those summon restrictions, and was unaffected by other card effects. Combined with a sick 3500 attack, and your opponent would be left scrambling for a way to out this. But that was basically a giant vanilla. If you wanted some more spice, Red Eye's Dark Dragoon was a bit more vulnerable and lacked the ability to pop cards because you cheated it out without using any vanilla fusion materials. It still has fantastic protections and a slick negate that can make it even bigger than Falcon. And the potential targets for this get more dangerous the longer the game goes on. I just picked Dragoon because it was one of my favorites. Sadly, this falls into the camp of cards that have a lot of potential but are too passive to be relied on. And honestly, once they started printing monsters that could handle these cards in battle, their market share plummeted. Thanks, Access Code Talker. It's a neat trick to randomly pull on your locals, but until we return to formats where mass back row removal is prevalent, or, you're running Artifact Durandal, you're much better going the route of Upstart Goblin and just touching some grass. Mind the tall bit of that, though. You never know what sinister serpents are lying within. Dark Factory of More Production is a continuous trap card that lets you send a monster from your hand or field to the grave to draw a card. You can do this once per turn, and because it's a trap card, this means you can trigger this on both players' turns. This essentially turns all of your monsters into their own Upstart Goblins, allowing you to trade them for a fresh draw. But this is even better because if they have graveyard effects, now you're double dipping, and you're triggering those at quick speed. The only real shame here is that as the quality of cards overall has gone way up over the past few years, even something that cycles you through your cards at a pretty consistent rate while being a graveyard enabler just doesn't cut it. Maybe if it actually discarded, it might have some utility with triggering things like dangers, but for now it's just a nifty little machine that could have some applications in more limited formats, where finding your bomb cards ASAP is a chief concern over having multi-card synergies. But for the love of God, be sure you're trained on using that machine. Each one of those angry Moki Mokis represents 3,000 attack, and that's a catastrophic amount of power all in one place. In fact, we may need to consider breaking out the hazmat suits at this rate. Extra Buck is a continuous trap card, and each time any number of cards are added to your extra deck, place a spell counter on this card, maximum of 3. And you can send this card with 3 spell counters on it to the graveyard to draw 2 cards. So hey, this seems like a really neat card to have around in Pendulum decks. Every time they get destroyed or you use them as material for something, you stock up some counters and get some free draws out of it, basically rewarding you for what you were aiming to do anyway. But I'm sure you remember me making this complaint before, it's too slow. As is the curse of trap cards, we can't use any of their effects until the turn after they've been set. So this has a fairly long cooldown before we can even begin to accumulate the counters needed to cash out. And that's if this thing survives that long. So instead of waiting for a card to generate counters on it, you could just play another card that actually advances your board state immediately. Extra Buck may seem tempting. After all, a buck saved is a buck earned, but a spell counter saved isn't even worth the Power Stone that it's printed on. Kingyo Sukui is a continuous trap card that has you targeting a monster in your opponent's grave. Excavate the top card of your deck, and if it's a monster card with the same attribute as the target, add it to your hand. And if you do, shuffle the target into the deck. Otherwise, send the excavated card to the graveyard, also destroy this card. Hey, remember this one from the Goblin gift video? Now we're saying this from the other perspective. It's basically a strange kind of graveyard hate, though does require you to have impeccable knowledge of your own top deck to ensure you're aiming at the right monsters so your act of scooping it away from your opponent will not be in vain. Or, use this as a way to excavate the top card of your deck. Sylvans are super into it, and they haven't had good support in, God, years. In fact, I think the Goblin would prefer it that way. I don't have a new observation in this video. Upstart is selling faulty ladles to this kid at an alarming rate. I'm starting to see how he can afford that castle. Or the lawn in front of that castle, anyways. Redeemable Jar is a continuous trap card that has you banishing a trap card from your grave to add a trap card from your grave to your hand with a different original name from the banished card. There we go, we've got ourselves some trap card recursion. Ship one out to get another one back into rotation, ensuring you give yourself a steady supply of trap cards to keep your back row as threatening as ever. If you find yourself playing a lot of normal trap cards, I would actually recommend giving this card a shot. One of the hardest things about running defensive trap cards is that they hardly ever cover their own cost, meaning you'll run out of gas almost immediately once you get started. Redeemable Jar gives you the chance to get extra mileage out of those cards, making them last just a little longer, helping you to see the end of the game, even if you have to use used trap cards. Not that there's anything wrong with that, being thrifty is a virtue after all, and I mean, those trap cards were just languishing in your graveyard anyway, you might as well get some trade-in value for them. Redeemable Jar truly is the GameStop of trap card support, which at this point I'm not sure if that's a compliment or derision. Royal Prison is a continuous trap card that prevents monsters from being special summoned from the grave. Pretty straightforward. If you expect to be facing a lot of graveyard summoning decks during a format, this card has you covered. As for our Goblin friend, they're not the center of attention, but lean a bit to the right and you'll see that Upstart is also locked up in here, which means that the Huge Revolution series of cards is now wrapped up in anything the Upstart Goblin touches. This means he's in the same company as the Temper Tantrum Tyrant, so hey, maybe the two will get to meet each other more directly and swap stories one day. I feel like the two have a lot in common. Looking down on the peasants? Always a fun pastime. Cashback is a counter trap card that, when your opponent activates a spell card, trap card, or monster effect by paying life points, negate the activation, and if you do, return it to the deck. Now this is a pretty wide-sweeping counter trap card. Life points are another good resource to pay with, making the usage of these cards very appealing, which makes them ripe for cash backing. Not only will your opponent be paying all those life points for nothing, the card also gets spun right back to the deck. So no graveyard recycling or anything like that, this card is just gone. That being said, cards like Solemn Judgment can hit things that don't use life points, so its range is much larger and will thus see more success over the long term of the game. It turns out, even when your counter trap is free to use, paying a premium is always going to be the way to go as long as you get some good value out of it. But I will admit, I'm sure it feels aces to hit a Solemn Judgment that just sank 4k life points, only for you to flip the factory warranty card. How much do you think they got back for that Jar of Greed, you think? Goblin Out of the Frying Pan is a counter trap card that has you paying 500 life points to negate the activation of a spell card and return it to its owner's hand. This, along with Malfunction, are a duo of counter traps that hit a wide category of cards, but don't really do much in exchange for costing so little. Malfunction is notable because when you halt trap cards like this, you're ensuring they have to wait for at least a turn before using them again, but when you do this to a spell card, if it's not a hard once per turn, your opponent can just play it again. This means the card's best use cases are against field spells that usually have that restriction and are needed to boost the consistency of a deck, themes that use quick play spell cards, that way they run into a similar situation as with Malfunction, and with stopping powerful board breakers, though even that's not totally reliable. Lightning Storm is one of the best cards in the game for clearing out opposing boards, and it says you can only activate one copy of it per turn. So because it doesn't say you can only use a copy of it once per turn, you can Frying Pan the Lightning Storm back to their hand, and because you negated the activation, well, they've got another one that turn, so they'll just play it again. This card is infuriating, and I'm not really sure what the idea behind it was, unless it was to be as annoying as the Upstart Goblin is here, because if that was the case, it's working! Polynosis is a counter trap card that can be used when any number of monsters would be normal or special summoned, or when a spell or trap card is activated. Tribute a plant monster to negate the summon or activation, and if you do, destroy that card. This is basically beat for beat Solemn Judgment, providing a ton of coverage. You just now have to pay a plant instead of life points, which honestly is a nice trade for the plant decks of the day. Material was cheap, and so having a way to handle basically any card that came their way was welcomed, even if it did resolve as an unfavorable 2-for-1. Sometimes hitting the right card is worth more than card advantage. If this was searchable, I'm positive this would still see play today as some kind of archetypal counter trap. But alas, this too has fallen to the wayside, especially since you can now just play Solemn Judgment at 3. Kind of makes you wonder why they even bothered to bring that card back in the first place, because every counter trap in the game has to compare itself to Solemn Judgment, and nothing else really measures up. Though I would say, at least given the time it was released, Polynosis was nothing to sneeze at. Recall is a counter trap card that you can activate when your opponent activates a monster effect. Your opponent draws a card, also negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. Hey, that sounds oddly familiar, and that's because this is a monster effect version of the controversial Dark Bribe. The idea of the cost of a counter trap being that your opponent gets to draw a card, meaning they're getting another chance to deploy all manner of hardships against you, seemed ridiculous. And that's because it was. Outside of certain edge cases, you were solving a problem by creating at least one more, if you were lucky. Recall is much the same way, though because you are dealing with monsters, this actually has the added benefit of being able to destroy big threats on board, and for only a single draw for our opponent, yeah, that seems pretty good. It's certainly better than dealing with negation body number 12. And hey, things are finally looking up for the Upstart Goblin. I would say nowadays that Pot of Desires is a big upgrade over Pot of Duality. Maybe not all recalls are bad. And that's all the cards that Upstart Goblin is featured in. You'll forgive me for not having a tech pick section. Turns out this giant group of cards doesn't have a through line that we can add support to. Honestly, it's more of a history lesson and or catalog video than anything else. Instead, if you'd be so kind, I'd like to hear from all of you actually. Did you discover any new cards from this video that you hadn't previously seen? And do any of these wacky cards find their way into your brews? Let me know all about them in the comments below, and if you haven't already, please be sure to like the video if you liked it, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, be sure to click one of my other videos in the suggested feed to help this show up in your homepage, and be sure to share this video with somebody you know who loves Yu-Gi-Oh! It really does a lot to help me out. Today's episode is brought to you by Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales and get 5% off your order by using the coupon code GoldenNova at checkout. It was also brought to you by my lovely patrons, including this month's illustrious Quasar Commanders, Upstairs Media and the Critic of Innocence, Nebula Navigator's 3rd Dynasty, 50 Gigabytes, Ada Basilisk, Adam Zajdel, Ancient Wizard, Andrew Newman, Battle Axe, Kane Senpai, Chibi Gohan, Christopher Fuss, Clockswork, Comrade Copperbottom, Eric, Frankie, Garland Chaos, Green Knight, Great Big Pillock, Hair Bear, Happy Majin, Harry the Ominous Benefactor, Iron Zero, Iskander 711, Carp, Marion James E. Picata, Millennia Asta, Muse Clark, Neon Yaminair, Orozco 09096, Panther J, Bat Boos, Rebel King Lucifer, Red Eyes Jackalow, RJ the Jank Monarch, Thievery Coast and the Wizard Moose, Cosmic Crusaders Ally Vatnia, Animasta, Anthrac, Baron von Titty Sprinkles, Beelzephyr, Fish, Beluga Masta, Blitzwolf, Charlie Mercury, Chaz Ghost, Dr. Entity RIP, Aaron the World Breaker, Eva Padilla, Gary Lickbread, Hike Boyagian, Herbal D, Inblink, Kale the Dragon, Lobomaru 02, Manga Pages, Matt Simmons, Natiel Lee Alexander, Nitromo, Not Al Gore, Nyx, Obsidian, Rainer Leong, Rhyme Kairos, Schwinny, Shizuka Nijimura, Sir Knight JCB, Sophie, apparently, Sphilia, Stephen Williamson, The Legendary Raven, The Phantom Knights of Shitted Pants, The Gene, Tiger X2476, Weasel King of Weaseltown, and Zaldareka, as well as the wonderful Starlight Explorers you see on screen now. If you'd like to help me in my journey to cover all of Yu-Gi-Oh's archetypes, get my videos early, be a part of these credits and other awesome perks, it would mean the world to me if you would check out the link to my Patreon in the description or consider joining as a YouTube member. And if you'd like to see the exploits of another goblin throughout the game's history, check out this video covering the Goblin gift cards. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.